Welcome to today's Multnomah Group webinar presentation, Plan Design Trends in Higher Education. My name is Erik Daley, and I am the Managing Principal of the Multnomah Group. I have a few housekeeping items before I jump into today's agenda. Everyone's phone, other than mine, is on mute. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation. There should be a Q&A dialog box on your Citrix system, so if you want to submit questions, we'll try and get those addressed throughout the course of today's presentation. We'll also be providing copies of today's content, as well as making available a recorded version of today's presentation for those that wish to listen to it at another time or share it with your colleagues. The agenda we have is pretty broad. We're going to talk about the compensation model in higher education and what the transition from traditional pension benefits to defined contribution benefits has done to that compensation model. Given new defined contribution phenomena, we're also going to talk about the critical elements of plan design that contribute to not only retirement plan health, but institutional health. About some of the services that are provided within the spectrum of retirement planning and those impact outcomes, as well as investment structures and employee education needs. And then we'll close with really 5 critical secular steps that institutions should take in helping generate better outcomes in their retirement planning process. The compensation model in higher education is relatively unique. For most institutions, on average, 75% of the costs of running the institution are in somehow related to personnel and personnel-related expenses. Not all of that's compensation. A huge component is attributable to what tends to be the richest forms of benefits, retirement, and health in comparison to for-profit or even other tax-exempt institutions in the healthcare arena. Salaries are especially expensive within that, as we've seen more and more students transition away from liberal arts degrees and into business and engineering, accounting. That's had a significant impact on the cost of attracting new talent on the faculty side. And the costs associated with the retention of higher education employees go beyond even direct compensation and benefits. Really, there's significant paid time off for research. There's additional graduate assistance to support the research effort. There's equipment and facilities to attract the talent that we all like to have on our campus available. And then ultimately, the phenomena that changes and makes retirement planning as a component of higher education compensation significant is the tenure model. The tenure model provides an environment where we have significant increases over the years in labor costs, and shifting faculty needs ultimately can be disadvantaged by the tenure model. So again, the fact that we have liberal arts professors who can't necessarily transition to teaching coursework in areas where our students may have the highest degree of interest really limits our institutional flexibility. And when we look at the compensation model in higher education, and this is data from the American Association of University Professors, the 2011-2012 academic year, this is just direct compensation on average in institutions. So you've got instructors on average are making about $48,000, assistant professors at about $67,000, associate professors at about $79,000, and then full professors about $113,000. Again, that model that pushes towards tenure-type employment tracks for faculty certainly can create an environment by which we have more and more expensive faculty, which does have some significant impacts on economic flexibility for the plan sponsor institution. And we've made a significant change, and I don't even want to say it's a trend because it's far, far beyond a trend. We're in the For private institutions, we're in the very latter stages, and for public institutions, we're probably in the middle of this trend away from defined benefit pension to defined contribution 403B type retirement structures as being the primary form of benefit for employees at higher education institutions. Once upon a time in the defined benefit environment, what we had was essentially an environment where the plan was primarily employer funded, and occasionally, depending on the design, it may have required some participant contributions. The investment strategy was entirely dictated by the institution, and really from a participant perspective, the critical thing that they kept in mind was how much replacement income do I need, and ultimately how many years and at what age will I generate the necessary replacement income to maintain my standard of living. The challenge for institutions, of course, was the volatility issue. So in addition to investment returns dictating how much an institution may have to contribute any year, even in the most recent period when markets have been strong, we've been in an environment where interest rates have been low, and ultimately the cost of providing benefits to plan sponsors has been tremendously high. But the other side of that was participants were very safe. Ultimately, they were protected against longevity investment risk in a defined benefit pension structure. In addition to defined contribution plans, we have achieved the primary goal, which is that ultimately plan sponsors have had a significant reduction in volatility. It's a significantly easy to budget item. If my employer contribution is 9% of pay, my contributions ultimately will be 9% of payroll. I can budget that year over year over year. It will not be a floating liability on my income statement. However, is now we've taken one defined benefit pension plan where ultimately the institution had the investment prowess, and they acknowledged the fact that some employees would live to 97 and others would die at 67, and ultimately the balancing of those provided an environment where we could provide lifetime income for our employees. But now, by taking a plan that may have had 2,000 participants in the defined benefit side, all we've really done is take that 2,000 and split it into 2,000 individual defined benefit plans. Each participant has to go through the process of trying to evaluate ultimately how much retirement income they'll need, transition that to accumulation, and risks associated with longevity and investment are now borne by the participant. But it doesn't ultimately change the amount of money that's required. If anything, it increases the amount of money that's required because every participant, even the ones who will die at 67, don't know it ahead of time. And as a result, they need to plan and save as if they're going to live to 107. Actually, the accumulated dollars that are required in defined contribution structure are higher than that's required in a defined benefit pension plan. And participant safety is ultimately what suffers. So participants who have to ensure their own retirement preparedness ultimately have to take a much more conservative bent, and as a result, that has consequences on the payroll model in higher education. The end of the transition, employees who primarily rely on a DC plan tend to retire 1 to 2 years later than employees covered by a pension plan. Individuals covered by a DB plan are 87% more likely to retire in any given year than individuals that are only covered by a defined contribution plan. And a 1% increase in the S&P 500 index in any given year increases the probability that a retiree will retire by 2.5%. How participants ultimately feel about the accumulations in the market has a significant impact on when our older workers elect to transition out of the workforce. These retirements are tremendously costly. If you go back to the economic model of assistant professors, associate professors, and instructors to tenured and very senior tenured faculty, you're talking about a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 impact on direct labor costs. But delayed retirements increase health care costs. Health care for a 65-year-old worker is twice that of a worker between the ages of 45 and 54. And more importantly, young talent is impacted by the prospect of their career being stagnated. So if they look at an institution where their opportunities for tenure and employment advancement are limited because there are too many people at the end of the funnel, then they tend to take their talents elsewhere, and we're back starting over again trying to generate new talent on the faculty side. So with the defined contribution plan, I've seen a number of different presentations where people try and chop up different types of participants and make a finer and finer and finer cut. But the reality is a defined contribution is nothing other than a progression from early saving to accumulation to pre-retiree and out into the retirement workforce. So for our savers, what we really have is primarily a younger group of lower income workers. And the challenge for this group of workers is that every retirement dollar is in direct competition for a dollar of take-home pay early in a young saver's life. If we get them past that phase, they ultimately become accumulators. They're mid-career, they're highly productive, they tend to be financially secure, and if we can keep their dollars in the plan and their employment prospects consistent, they migrate to becoming pre-retirees who are accomplished, experienced, and concluded the costs of establishing their family life. So at this point, perhaps they've gotten their kids out of post-secondary education to the extent they're doing that. Their payments are reliable. A number of the things that they invested on earlier in their working career have now concluded. So for the young savers, what we really want to do is get them started in the retirement savings process as early as possible. We want to reward engagement and patience. And we want to affirm the commitment to the beginning of the savings process. We want to get as many of these people in as possible because if we do that, they'll eventually become accumulators. For the accumulators, our objective is really to demonstrate the progress toward retirement readiness, reduce the impact of leakage on their ability to successfully achieve retirement, and begin educating on what retirement actually is in a defined contribution setting. Critical group in many ways is the pre-retiree group. How can we, given the fact that all of the risks associated with investment performance and longevity fall upon them individually, provide them extensive access to financial planning advice, focus on their retirement plan as a tool for securing retirement rather than just an accumulation and wealth transfer tool, identify opportunities to help incent them feel comfortable about their prospects for retirement. So I'm going to end the majority of my time talking about the design mechanisms that go into a retirement plan because ultimately I think this is the opportunity that you plan sponsors and those responsible for safeguarding your retirement plan have the greatest ability to impact the success of the retirement plan. Focus on those plan design design opportunities. Also focus on some of the services that can really complement what you do from a design perspective. And last but certainly not least, talk about the opportunities to educate participants and where you should focus your limited education resources to achieve the best retirement readiness outcome. From a benefit design perspective, we have some challenges in higher education. One of the challenges we don't have is we certainly are contributing significant dollars as a percentage of employee pay to retirement. This is from the Plan Design Higher Education study recently conducted by Fidelity. It looks at both public and private plan peer groups. And the beauty, at least, of this chart is that most institutions are providing a benefit significantly higher than similar-sized peer institutions in the for-profit marketplace. Of this particular investment economic model, of course, is that the vast majority of those contributions are not contingent to any level of participation by the employee population. And secondarily, the contribution rates are high enough that many participants fail to acknowledge, understand, or recognize the reality that even with retirement benefits as strong or as high as those listed, that participants have to contribute in tax-deferred to complement the contributions that are being provided by the employer. The rule of thumb for those that start early in their working and accumulation careers that they're going to need to set aside somewhere between 10 to 15% of total income to generate adequate income replacement. So going back to a plan that may contribute even 8 to 12% of pay, that's still going to require employees to contribute anywhere from 2 to 7 to 8% of their own compensation to make the critical accumulation needs they're going to have later in the retirement process. From a mind focusing on the young saver portion of our population, there are really three things, opportunities for higher education institutions to moderate and change how their plans are designed to achieve better outcomes. And one that we see regularly in higher education is employee mandatory contributions. So ultimately bridging a gap between what the employer provides and requiring employees as a condition of employment to contribute some of their own income to generate the necessary accumulations. The second, and one that is used very infrequently still in higher education, is automatic enrollment, not escalation. So ultimately, rather than having participants elect into a tax-deferred annuity structure, deferring some of their own income, using automatic enrollment as a mechanism to capture participants who can elect out, but ultimately aren't required to conclude paperwork to get into the plan. And importantly, along with auto enrollment is auto escalation. So how do we get participants from 3 or 4% up to the 6, 7, or 8% that is likely required to generate their replacement ratio and retirement needs? And then some institutions, they're reviewing this desire to make flat rate mandatory employer contributions and instead having a mandatory employer contribution of a smaller amount which is subsidized by a matching contribution of a larger amount. So essentially requiring employees to defer some of their own income to ultimately get higher total contribution in a match hybrid formula. Mandatory contributions, clearly it's 100% adoption. We don't have to worry about anybody opting out. We get every single participant, and based on the employer contribution and the mandatory contribution from the employee, can design plans that should effectively meet the majority of our employee population accumulation goals. Ultimately, over time, those mandatory contributions can be perceived ultimately as higher employer contributions and lower take-home pay. So employees who are looking at take-home pay as the primary metric ultimately see this mandatory employee contribution as not necessarily beneficial to their take-home. And the challenge is that implementing new employee mandatory contributions is very, very difficult. So the plans that tend to have employee mandatory contributions have been around for decades. It's part of the institutional culture. Implementing new plans has been much, much more challenging for institutional plan sponsors. This can be said of the adopting a hybrid match formula. In some cases, from a pro perspective, if you're the institution, hoping that engaging participants and requiring their participation in tax deferrals will cause them to engage in the retirement planning process and make better decisions as a result. The con, however, the impact of the change may not be as significant as the political cost of adopting. So if you look at studies related to implementing match formulas, there's a large portion of the population that seems to be unimpacted by matching contributions and their decision to participate or not participate. For our most sophisticated participants, they are deferring at the highest possible levels without regard to what the match contributions are. There is a group in the middle, which is maximizing benefits and tying their contribution to potential match contributions, and they certainly will be impacted. But the bottom end of the distribution curve also have a significant portion of the population with managing take-home pay. And changes to the employer contribution formula tend not to have a significant impact on their desire or willingness to contribute. And like employee mandatory contributions, adopting hybrid match formulas definitely has a political cost. You take away what had been a quote-unquote guaranteed benefit and are making it contingent upon employee contributions. There are also some institutions, especially on the private side, that may have social equity mandates, where providing a hybrid match may actually reduce the retirement readiness of some of the lowest paid workers who may go from having a 6, 8, 10% contribution to perhaps a 3 or 4% fixed contribution, eligible for a match that they're likely not to receive. Where more and more institutions initiate transitions that tend to have positive outcomes, although they take time to create the desired outcome, in the auto-enrollment and auto-escalation side. Pros, that it fundamentally doesn't change the contract between the employer and the participant. Rates don't change. The only thing that changes really is a administrative issue related to we assume you want to participate in enrollment, or whether we assume you don't want to participate when to opt into a plan. While auto-enrollment can be instituted in such a way that addresses current employees, the reality is that the vast majority of plan sponsors tend to initiate auto-enrollment prospectively, meaning that the next new employee would be subject to automatic enrollment. So it doesn't necessarily fix any of the issues related to the hundreds of thousands of employees that you currently have on campus that may not be saving at a rate suitable or adequate to their retirement needs. The good news, implementation is really easy from an institutional pushback perspective. Recently worked with a client who surveyed their participant population, and the vast majority of employees were favorable to automatic enrollment, with the caveat that it not apply to them because they're already employed, and that only apply to the next new employee who got retained by the college. So culturally, it can be easy. Admittedly, it can be more challenging. A number of higher education institutions use very customized payroll systems, occasionally don't look at employees as a whole, and as a result, getting new employees with accurate dates of hire, which is a critical component to having a successful auto-enrollment and auto-escalation program, can be very, very challenging. The secondary option, or the secondary issue, has to do with the eligibility. So it is not atypical for institutions to have employer retirement benefits and not make adjunct faculty eligible for those employer retirement benefits. Traditionally, adjunct professors have been eligible to contribute to the TA or defer their own income into the plan. So design auto-enrollment features, you have to make some decisions about, do you want to auto-enroll employees who are not going to be eligible for employer contributions? And so do you risk having a large number of more short-term or temporary employees ultimately clogging up your plan operation? The opportunities seem pretty significant in both the auto-enrollment and auto-increase programs. Higher education, still less than 5% of sponsors are utilizing either auto-enrollment or auto-increase programs. Far, far less significant than even the not-for-profit healthcare side, and certainly the corporate side. I'd argue that the corporate side would be far, far higher if it were not for the fact that most corporate plans use a match formula. So by auto-enrolling participants in match-type environment, it actually increases the liability associated with the employer contribution. So some of the limits to the initiation or the institution of auto-enrollment and auto-increase are less prevalent in education, and even despite that, we tend not to see the same levels of adoption. Given a small sample size, I'll throw out comprehensive data on higher education and the impact of auto-enrollment. Let's look at the defined contribution corporate marketplace and take a look at the differences in participation in the, essentially what would be the tax-deferred annuity or the deferral portion of a 403B plan for our corporate DC brethren. Plans without auto-enrollment, plan participation rate's only about 54%, which, by the way, is almost exactly what the participation rate is in higher education for TDA services. For those plans that do have an auto-enrollment feature, it's 83%, Most recently, we worked with an institution in the Northwest to implement auto-enrollment. It looked at period over period, fourth quarter of 2011 to fourth quarter of 2012. The institution saw a 220% increase in auto-enrollment uptake for new employees. And of the new employees who were enrolled after the auto-enrollment, 60% of those were because of auto-enrollment. Had it not been for the auto-enrollment provisions, a significant majority of that population likely either would have, A, deferred participating, so they never would have got in, but maybe that would have taken a year or 2 years, and ultimately would have reduced their retirement readiness. And for some portion of them, at least statistically about half of them, they never would have become participants in the retirement plan. So in the plan, the question is, how do we keep the dollars in the plan and we keep employees and participants progressing toward retirement readiness? And in this accumulation phase, we really focus on leakage. And the adage, neither a borrower or lender could never be more true than it is in retirement plans, and specifically in 403B retirement plans. There are 3 issues that are affecting leakage, one of which, and a significant one that unfortunately as plan sponsors have little control over, is this notion of plan rollovers. We'll talk about some of the demographics there, but as employees shift from career to career, employer to employer, the ability and unfortunately the frequency with which employees take significant distributions of their retirement accumulations is tremendously detrimental to retirement readiness. We do think there's some things that you can do as plan sponsors, and we'll talk about those as well. Second is retirement plan loans. Most plans have a loan provision. There are limits in some cases on loans, but loans is another area where ultimately dollars are leaking out of the retirement plan, and not least is hardship withdrawals. So many plans have a provision participants who are experiencing a financial hardship to take money out of the retirement plan to meet that immediate financial need. And we'll talk about some things that you can do to review those provisions and certainly optimize the ability of participants not to be significantly negatively impacted by what happens on the retirement side or the hardship side. Leakage, some interesting statistics. Only 20% of employees who take a lump sum distribution roll proceeds of that distribution into another tax-qualified IRA or retirement plan account, according to the General Accounting Office. While we read about this issue in the accumulation phase is because participants ages 35 to 45 and in some of those prime working years are the most likely to borrow. And when they do borrow, they're most likely to maximize the amount of the loan as compared to their younger and older counterparts. Current estimated loan default rate is 17.4%. For defined contribution plans in aggregate. I think if you were to look at 403B plans, you would find that the statistics for loan default are actually higher, especially in instances where participants are not repaying loans through payroll deductions, but instead are making coupon payments. It's not atypical when we look at loan statistics for clients that have that loan structure to see default rates that are 30 or 40 or 50%, and often experienced by exactly the same participant repetitively. Interestingly, despite the fact that the loan default rate is 17.4%, most plans have a plan loan interest rate that is tied to prime. Prime's currently 3.25, which means that loans that participants are taking are somewhere between 3.25% and 5.25%. And despite the fact that we have a 17.4% default rate, it would be difficult to find anywhere where you have a banking institution that had default rates that high, that had interest rates that low. It's certainly not sustainable, and the Internal Revenue Service has given some guidance periodically that says should have loan interest rates that are somehow tied to what would generally be available. Again, 17.4% default would probably put you in the mid-20s for an interest rate if you were to pull the actuaries out to take a look at it. The good hardship withdrawals are much less prevalent. If you look at it statistically, it's on average about 1.5%. The critical issue here is that many plans, however, because of guidance, restrict employees who have a hardship from continuing to contribute to the plan. The note here being that if you have a financial hardship, you probably shouldn't be deferring income into the plan. The challenge is if a participant really does meet the financial hardship obligation by taking money out of the plan, we would hope that we would be able to keep them in the contribution phase. To the extent that they have the eligibility for matching contributions, we'd certainly want to keep them in the plan. So anything that keeps them out for a period of time also reduces our ability to get them back in. So we take these participants who are already disadvantaged because of their financial hardship and perhaps enhance the challenge that they're going to have for retirement savings. But first, focus on the retirement plan loan side of the equation. If you go from 2006 to 2011, we've had a notable spike in the percentage of participants with an active loan. So in 2011, about 18.5% of participants had a loan outstanding on their account balance. That's up more than 20% from 2006, where it was about 15%. The same time, retirement assets in defined contribution plans is up a little more than 10%. So the growth rate on loan activity is actually faster than the growth of assets within defined contribution plans. Very, very troubling statistic. And the challenge is that with technology, we've made the processing of these loans easier and faster. It's certainly easier to get a retirement plan loan from a good record keeper than to get it almost anywhere else. So plans that have automated loan provisions, you'll routinely see the active loans outstanding are 20 to 25% of account holding participants. And again, if they're repaying those loans, that certainly diminishes the impact on the plan, although the impact is still there because typically even repaying loans crowds out other retirement savings. And the great challenge is that about 17% or more of those loans will be defaulted, and those dollars will come out of the plan, obviously penalized and taxed at the time of distribution. Then plan design on the pre-retiree side. So if we're able to keep money in the plan, we've got you engaged as a young saver. We've been able to keep the money in the plan in the accumulation phase and help the pre-retirees. A lot comes down to some of the same facets and factors that impact the accumulators. How do we manage the in-service plan distribution provisions and early retirement windows that are becoming more and more prevalent in higher education? On the service plan distribution side, we see routinely plans that provide employees that are between 59.5 and 65 and older the ability to begin taking distributions from their retirement plans while they're currently employed. The challenge or the prevailing wisdom associated with the provision is twofold. One is, well, the IRS, because they don't take an early distribution penalty at 59.5, must no longer care, and as a result, we as the employer don't want to put any restrictions that are beyond what the IRS does. Second is, hey, participants as they get older may have additional diversification needs that we don't anticipate in the plan, and by creating this early distribution window or this in-service plan distribution window, we give them the opportunity to do that within an IRA account. The challenge is that we create leakage, and we also don't create the necessary incentive to help our employees transition to retirement. So early retirement windows or in-service plan distributions can be an adequate feature if they're tied to a phased retirement program. So if we have tenured faculty that are going from full-time to half-time as part of a 3-year or 5-year or 2-year or 4-year transition on to retirement, then creating an early distribution or in-service plan distribution provision makes sense. They'll get half their income from employment. They'll get half of their income from beginning to take distributions from their accumulated retirement plan. But if we create an avenue by which participants continue to make full employment wage, have all their health care benefits and all the other related benefits associated with employment, but can begin to do things with their retirement dollars what that tends to do is extend the amount of time that they're employed. That we're seeing more and more institutions look at are the provisions associated with making post-severance contributions to a retirement plan. So institutions are trying to incent a portion of their population from engaging in an early retirement window, and the 403B regulations, depending on how your plan's designed, allow institutions to say, if you retire, I'll make retirement plan contributions despite the fact that you're no longer employed here for the next 3 years. There are a couple of challenges associated with that, and the first is it has to be highly, highly targeted. The early retirement windows where we make it available and we get all the wrong people to leave, the folks that are highly productive and have lots of other employment opportunities, doesn't necessarily generate the institutional health that you're seeking. Second is that if you do that frequently, what you ultimately create is an environment where everyone waits until they get the additional incentive associated with retirement. And that keeping of expectations may actually cause your plan to lose the ability to transition people from internal to external as quickly as you'd like. Services perspective, our focus is keep it simple, stupid for participants. If you look, there's been a number of studies, and I pulled one here from J.P. Morgan that looked at participants and how they self-identify. In this case, over 2/3 self-identified as delegators. They said they had very limited investment and retirement knowledge, and they'd like somebody to do it for them. You have the 30% that are do-it-yourselfers. They're typically putting together their own portfolio and savings rates. And 20% that are self-directed sophisticates. And even if yours differs, even significantly, the beauty is that your sophisticates will always optimize their outcomes. So no matter how you design your plan from an investment structure perspective, from a auto enrollment or not perspective, hybrid match or not perspective, those participants will always get as much out of the retirement benefit as they can. For the remainder of the population, you need to make it easy to enroll, easy to allocate, easy to use, and I should probably add easy to retire. Let's get easier for participants to be getting retirement income in a way that makes sense for them. We look at as one that's commonly referred to related to investment flexibility and the impact that creating more and more investment options has on the willingness of employees to participate in the plan. And when I talk about willingness to participate, I'm really talking a bit about salary deferrals, their ability and willingness and interest in enrolling in the plan and putting their own income at stake. So the study ultimately revealed that the more complicated, the broader the set of investments, you saw a pretty significant decline in participation rates. This issue is even more heavily prevalent in higher education, where we continue to see investment menus that are larger and larger and larger. I'll give you a contrast. So there's been some really good writings by Professor Thomas Dvorak at Union College, who writes about higher education retirement plans. In a recent blog post that he put up, he took at the IBM plan, which is the largest corporate 401k plan in the country, $36 billion in total accumulated assets, and almost $250 million participants in the plan. That plan has 23 investment options. If you took the largest 12 private colleges and universities and looked at their investment options and plans, they combined have far less than $36 billion, about half or less, and on average, they have 167 investment options. So significant flexibility is designed to kind of appease the self-directed sophisticates, but in higher education, the majority of our population is not self-directed sophisticates. The majority are delegators and do-it-yourselfers, and creating an environment by which they can participate in the plan more easily and readily increase the likelihood that they're going to have the type of retirement outcomes that we would all like for them to have. I do like to point out that we can't fix saving behavior problems with investment returns. And perhaps worse yet, participants are ultimately, in many cases, disadvantaged by their own investment behavior in comparison to the broader index. So this is the Dow 2011 study of investor behavior, where the S&P 500 index, on average, during that 20-year period, was up a little more than 9%. The average equity investor was up 3.8%. The aggregate bond index over that 20-year period averaged a 7% return. The average fixed income investor was up 1%. Given the fact that such a large portion of our population is delegators, how can we help the least sophisticated of our population, or the least engaged of our population, achieve at least average returns so that their good investor and savings behavior will ultimately bear the fruit of a successful accumulation pattern? From the investment structure perspective, we think there are three critical ways that we can help participants who ultimately need the type of help that we can provide in a retirement plan structure. Those are managed accounts, target maturity products, and target risk products. On the target risk side, we're really just talking about the balanced fund model of old, right? A 60-40 allocation, a mix between stocks and bonds. It's a very simple process by which any investor can be either defaulted into or select to utilize a balanced allocation that's globally diversified and should not have the same expense of trailing the markets by the significant numbers that I pointed out in that Dalbar study. Cons is that ultimately target risk solutions do provide a lot of volatility on the two ends of the spectrum. So our younger workers who have limited retirement savings dollars are typically too conservative in using a balanced fund, and older workers who may be retiring in the next 2 to 3 years are likely more aggressive than we ultimately would like them to be. Then the target maturity products, the most popular and certainly the most prevalent currently of the e-investment structures, where participants are invested in, again, a balanced portfolio to equity or fixed income. That portfolio is defined by their age with respect to the plan's retirement age, typically 65. Pros is, again, it creates at least a suitable or reasonable approach to providing high levels of equity for younger workers and lower levels of equity for older workers. And it typically is a low cost structure than some of the other easy investment structures. The con, of course, is that age is not the only factor. Certainly spousal income, retirement needs, accumulated assets, certainly tolerance for risk. All those factors play into what would be perhaps optimal as opposed to just a suitable asset allocation, and target date funds don't account for that. We're seeing more and more institutions review at least managed accounts. So a managed account structure typically utilizes the underlying investment products that are part of your array and creates finite portfolios based on the data that's known about them. Certainly age is a critical one of those, but may also have income about their wage, about their savings behavior, and a number of those factors can be inputted into creating an asset allocation that is more custom or more appropriate than perhaps a typical target date fund would be. The sense of that particular solution is that, like target maturity products, which tend to have a single fixed expense ratio, the managed account structures do tend to carry additional managed account costs. Certainly, the performance a participant achieves would have to be better than what they would have achieved in a standard target maturity product to overcome the cost implication. The other pro is that in some managed account cases, not only do participants get a investment allocation structure, but sometimes they also get a retirement savings recommendation. So perhaps a notice from the managed account provider that says you increase your ability to retire by 3 years by increasing your deferral percentage by 2%. Those types of very customized messaging can have an impact on the willingness of participants to engage in the plan. Interestingly, when you look at the structure, we should focus from my perspective at least, in that 5th percentile and 25th percentile, those participants, again, the least engaged, the least sophisticated, really benefit from having either a balanced account solution, a managed account solution, or a target date solution. Investors do better and better and likely are more and more sophisticated in their investments. They do equivalently well whether they use an E investment structure or choose to allocate their own dollars in the portfolio. Education has limits, and this is always difficult in the higher education spectrum because education is critically important. The challenge as it relates to retirement is that by the time we get participants into the education spectrum, we're relying on them having a certain level of financial literacy that they may or may not have. And we're trying to wrestle against some very, very powerful behavioral finance hurdles to participating in retirement plans. Policymakers should be very concerned that retirement education does not increase the likelihood that financially vulnerable groups, women, persons without a college degree, and particularly persons with lower incomes, will save distributions, meaning not take distributions as they transition from job to job. The good news, however, from my perspective, is that behavior may be as or more impactful on participant savings behavior than employee education. So Journal of Public Economics, they actually did a study of retirement savings behavior, and it was in higher education. And what they found in the study was a significant correlation between investment savings behaviors broken out by college and department within the higher education spectrum. The good news here is by involving the participant populations and critical people from campus within the planning process, we can have a significant impact on having the information, the education trickle into all the various aspects of our campus. So by involving, for instance, members of faculty and members of staff in the retirement plan advisory groups, they essentially become catalysts for increasing retirement savings behavior, increasing investment allocation and performance outcomes. All those things have a significant and can have a significant impact on successful retirement accumulations. So, in focusing on the 3 phases in the defined contribution spectrum, there are things that education plans really need to focus on. And from our perspective, during the young saver phase, the enrollment phase, the education really needs to be financial literacy and savings behaviors. We don't need to be involved and should not get overly obsessed with the importance of investment selection on retirement plan participation, because especially in the early years, investment performance is a 3rd or 4th tier factor to successful retirement plan outcomes. We shouldn't require education to be a predecessor to participation. The faster we can get participants in the plan, the better. And we need to appreciate the importance of peer group behavior and leadership in furthering retirement plan performance. So we're going to have a bunch of people come to the human resource office and sit and listen to the benefits administrator. Maybe it's more important that we have them meet with someone in their department or division to explain the retirement plan in a way that may resonate more clearly with them. The accumulation factor, again, we need to continue focusing on literacy on the financial side, but now begin to incorporate the external factors on retirement: healthcare, insurance, Social Security. These are the things that participants are going to need to understand and have a high level of comfort in before they're going to be willing and able to make the transition to retirement. And highlight the effectiveness of their current behaviors, continually reinforce the positive things they're doing to help move them towards retirement. And at this point, we need to start providing additional personal education resources to validate their savings goals, because some portion of that accumulation process, when their account balance hits $50,000, $100,000, $150,000, are going to want, seek, and need additional education, guidance, and in some cases advice, and we need to be in a position to provide that. And retiree, I would argue that this is the group that benefits most significantly from education. As a result, the area where we as plan sponsors should invest the most in providing education. We need to look at our pre-retirees as a whole. No longer is what they're doing in their retirement plan an important aspect. We're going to have questions about external assets, spousal income, spending needs, insurance, healthcare costs and resources. They're going to need to understand the federal and state resources that are available to them. They're going to need advice on asset allocation. They're going to need to understand the liquidity constraints associated with the dollars that they have not only in this plan but perhaps elsewhere. And they're going to need comprehensive retirement income planning focused on new options, income planning, and how can they make the transition to a successful and safe retirement. From my perspective, education plan design looks like a big funnel. The wider we can make the mouth of the funnel, automatic enrollment, auto escalation that push participants towards full retirement preparedness. We need to fix and repair all the leaks funnel, and then to create as much safety, comfort, and understanding about what it means to make the transition so that participants not only feel safe in leaving, but have something to look forward to as they make the transition away from earned income and into retirement income. We're working with clients on as it relates to improving the plan. The first is getting a benchmark as to what your plan's current retirement readiness is. So how successful is your plan as constituted today in helping employees transition? And that needs to be looked at obviously in aggregate, but it also needs to be looked at with the necessary cuts in wage, culture, and department to give you greater insight into how the plan works in areas where it can be fixed. And then ultimately, we need to look at all the obstacles to engaging new hires in the participant process. I worked with a plan sponsor at one point who initiated an auto-enrollment program, and that was going to be how they fixed their low participation rate, which was roughly 55%. And we came back 6 months later and talked about what the change in participant behavior had been. And the challenge there had been that the human resource department, being very, very high touch, had sat down with every new employee and gave an enrollment form and explained if they did not fill the enrollment form out, they would be enrolled in the plan at 3%. And by essentially forcing participants to come to a decision, they didn't recognize the typical uptick in auto-enrollment participation rates that you would expect to see. So really look not only at what the kind of the standard wage objections may be and obstacles to new hire participation, but how fundamentally do you enroll your participants and are ways to make that process more effective. The mechanisms to move new hires toward adequate income replacement, meaning once we get them in the plan, if we get them at 3%, that is likely not going to be adequate to get them all the way to full income replacement. What can we do to get them to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% deferral rates when matched with employer contributions will likely get them to the replacement levels that we would expect. Plug the holes. Pull your current loan demographics reports. Take a look at how many loans you have outstanding. Take a look at those participants who, in some cases, based on your plan design, may have 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 cyclical loans that they've taken out and defaulted. Are there things that you can do to limit loans, potentially over time remove loans as an option within the plan, and educate participants on the significant impact that loans and loan defaults have on their ability to retire. Hardship withdrawal impact. The good news is hardship withdrawals are a very low impact retirement readiness item. So hardship withdrawals ultimately doesn't significantly hurt the ability of your employees to retire, and it does provide a safety net for those participants who are most at risk financially. Making sure that you enforce the terms of the hardships so that it doesn't become just a passbook checking account. The Internal Revenue Service has been very clear about what, from their perspective, the safe harbor hardship withdrawal impacts are. The secondary piece of that is making sure that we get those participants who have had to elect the hardship back into the plan as quickly as is possible. And then last, build the communication plan to support the objective. Develop an education policy with really emphasis on saving and financial literacy and very high-touch ladder pre-planning for retirees on the back end. One of these things, I think, you might appear to be, to some degree or another, paternalistic. But when you look at the data related to wage escalation and the compensation model within our industry, the reality is that these are not only good for participants in a paternalistic way, but I think create much greater institutional health, which is the goal of all of us on the human resource and finance side within our institutions. I'm going to throw it open to questions. You, again, can submit a question via the Q&A, and I'll try and kind of take those as they come in. Well, as we close out today, I want to thank everyone for participating. There again be questions come up after, and we would be more than happy to take those. You can feel free to call me or email me at any time. We have a question pop up. Coordinating some of the metrics and evaluation methods is more challenging when you have more than one 403B in play. Any suggestions on how to manage multi-vendor environments? I think traditionally in a multi-vendor environment, you're going to have to work with a third party to help aggregate the data, especially with some of the more prevalent providers on the 403B side. So we're working with an institution now and have worked with other institutions in the past that are either considering consolidating, aren't going to consolidate, or have recently consolidated, but under a scenario under which they have significant assets in multiple places. If you use a third party to help with some of the assessment related to retirement readiness, they can capture data from both vendor sides and begin to synthesize those with your payroll records. I think is the most streamlined way to get it done. I think that I've seen other institutions do that in-house as well, but there are some really complicated metrics on the back end to try and get to retirement readiness and participant behavior demographics. So it is undoubtedly more difficult in a multi-vendor or multi-plan environment, but you can capture the data as kind of unique SSNs and wage information with higher and the relevant information. You can still get there. It's probably 2 or 3 more steps in the calculation process. Question: what is the typical employer-sponsored contribution for higher education facilities, and what is the highest rate I have seen? The highest rate I've seen is 16. I'm not, I'm sure there's rates that may in fact be higher than that. We actually, tried to cull some data on, that particular point, but as you get for at least for private and public institutions, I'm going to scroll back to the one of the graphs where we went to that. I think the most prevalent rate is somewhere between 10 and 12%, and I think that again, a third of the population. I think there's a bunch that are 6 to 8. So especially on the private side, it's not uncommon to see again an 8 to 10% rate. The interesting thing, of course, in talking to actuaries, so you can get a contribution rate right here, which is 8 to 12% pay, and that's a very highly budgetable item. True plans, if you look at the total compensation cost over long periods of time, is really different than that. So having a true defined benefit plan doesn't in aggregate necessarily cost the institution more, but the volatility from year to year is so significant that we've seen obviously a tremendous transition, again, not only in private higher ed where the transition's almost done, but even on the public side where we see more and more institutions getting away from pure pension and into defined contribution environments. Another question, what data elements are typically used in current retirement readiness, and how do you calculate savings rates that are not part of the 403B plan? Employees move from employer to employer more frequently. It's hard to assume their total retirement savings. It's a great point. I think that the elements that we traditionally look at are certainly wage accumulations and savings behaviors are big ones. But the other ones that get into this issue about other retirement savings have to do with higher information. So if we're hiring someone who's 58 years old in our institution, it's not a reasonable assumption they haven't accumulated any dollars prior to employment. And even if that is true, that they haven't, I think that necessarily that should be a detriment to the retirement readiness. The success of our retirement plan shouldn't be judged on our ability to hire people at 50 who have no retirement savings and get them transitioned to retirement at age 65. But using data higher as a data point, you can use some other data about average accumulation patterns within higher education and say, well, the average 58-year-old has already accumulated X thousand dollars. We don't know if they have that, but we can at least build that into our assumptions as we measure the effectiveness of our plan. So I think that's one way to get to the data element. The good is if we have employees who are both who are outside the retirement plan, the reality is that level of retirement readiness is traditionally far, far higher. So if we have people who are enhancing what they're doing in the retirement plan with external savings, that's actually a great thing, and I don't think we have to worry tremendously about that portion of our population. Those people who are saving, again, in IRA accounts or in taxable accounts outside the plan tend to do so after they've maximized whatever benefit is attributable to or available under the terms of the retirement plan. So as a result, we don't have to, our level of concern, at least institutionally, is not as high. I know that there are providers on the keeping side that because of the nature of the individual annuity contracts are looking at their ability to potentially look at prior accumulations that have been gained or earned at other institutions that are also serviced by the same vendor to help maybe create a finer point on retirement accumulations, one that would be difficult to do if just looking at assets. So I think that could create some additional opportunities to get better, cleaner data. Great. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking with all of you soon.